the new God of the Incorruptedest, the new gods of the Incorruptedest, the new God of the Incorruptedest, the new goddess of the Incorruptedest, the new goddesses of the Incorruptedest, the new goddess of the Incorruptedest, the old God of the Incorruptedest, the old gods of the Incorruptedest, the old God of the Incorruptedest, the old goddess of the Incorruptedest, the old goddesses of the Incorruptedest, the old goddess of the Incorruptedest, the greater God of the Incorruptedest, the greater gods of the Incorruptedest, the greater God of the Incorruptedest, the greater goddess of the Incorruptedest, the greater goddesses of the Incorruptedest, the greater goddess of the Incorruptedest, the lesser God of the Incorruptedest, the lesser gods of the Incorruptedest, the lesser God of the Incorruptedest, the lesser goddess of the Incorruptedest, the lesser goddesses of the Incorruptedest, the lesser goddess of the Incorruptedest, the higher God of the Incorruptedest, the higher gods of the Incorruptedest, the higher God of the Incorruptedest, the higher goddess of the Incorruptedest, the higher goddesses of the Incorruptedest, the higher goddess of the Incorruptedest, the lower God of the Incorruptedest, the lower gods of the Incorruptedest, the lower God of the Incorruptedest, the lower goddess of the Incorruptedest, the lower goddesses of the Incorruptedest, the lower goddess of the Incorruptedest, the greater spirit of the Incorruptedest, the greater spirits of the Incorruptedest, the greater spirit of the Incorruptedest, the lesser spirit of the Incorruptedest, the lesser spirits of the Incorruptedest, the lesser spirit of the Incorruptedest, the higher spirit of the Incorruptedest, the higher spirits of the Incorruptedest, the higher spirit of the Incorruptedest, the lower spirit of the Incorruptedest, the lower spirits of the Incorruptedest, the lower spirit of the Incorruptedest, the major God of the Incorruptedest, the major gods of the Incorruptedest, the major God of the Incorruptedest, the major goddess of the Incorruptedest, the major goddesses of the Incorruptedest, the major goddess of the Incorruptedest, the minor God of the Incorruptedest, the minor gods of the Incorruptedest, the minor God of the Incorruptedest, the minor goddess of the Incorruptedest, the minor goddesses of the Incorruptedest, the minor goddess of the Incorruptedest, the superior God of the Incorruptedest, the superior gods of the Incorruptedest, the superior God of the Incorruptedest, the superior goddess of the Incorruptedest, the superior goddesses of the Incorruptedest, the superior goddess of the Incorruptedest, the inferior God of the Incorruptedest, the inferior gods of the Incorruptedest, the inferior God of the Incorruptedest, the inferior goddess of the Incorruptedest, the inferior goddesses of the Incorruptedest, the inferior goddess of the Incorruptedest, the ancestor God of the Incorruptedest, the ancestor gods of the Incorruptedest, the ancestor God of the Incorruptedest, the ancestor goddess of the Incorruptedest, the ancestor goddesses of the Incorruptedest, the ancestor goddess of the Incorruptedest, the ascendant God of the Incorruptedest, the ascendant gods of the Incorruptedest, the ascendant God of the Incorruptedest, the ascendant goddess of the Incorruptedest, the ascendant goddesses of the Incorruptedest, the ascendant goddess of the Incorruptedest, the descendant God of the Incorruptedest, the descendant gods of the Incorruptedest, the descendant God of the Incorruptedest, the descendant goddess of the Incorruptedest, the descendant goddesses of the Incorruptedest, the descendant goddess of the Incorruptedest, the transcendent God of the Incorruptedest, the transcendent gods of the Incorruptedest, the transcendent God of the Incorruptedest, the transcendent goddess of the Incorruptedest, the transcendent goddesses of the Incorruptedest, the transcendent goddess of the Incorruptedest, the past God of the Incorruptedest, the past gods of the Incorruptedest, the past God of the Incorruptedest, the past goddess of the Incorruptedest, the past goddesses of the Incorruptedest, the past goddess of the Incorruptedest, the present God of the Incorruptedest, the present gods of the Incorruptedest, the present God of the Incorruptedest, the present goddess of the Incorruptedest, the present goddesses of the Incorruptedest, the present goddess of the Incorruptedest, the future God of the Incorruptedest, the future gods of the Incorruptedest, the future God of the Incorruptedest, the future goddess of the Incorruptedest, the future goddesses of the Incorruptedest, the future goddess of the Incorruptedest, the authentic God of the Incorruptedest, the authentic gods of the Incorruptedest, the authentic God of the Incorruptedest, the authentic goddess of the Incorruptedest, the authentic goddesses of the Incorruptedest, the authentic goddess of the incorruptedest, the synthetic god of the incorruptedest, the synthetic gods of the incorruptedest, the synthetic god of the incorruptedest, the synthetic goddess of the incorruptedest, the synthetic goddesses of the incorruptedest, the synthetic goddess of the incorruptedest, the progressive god of the incorruptedest, the progressive gods of the incorruptedest, the progressive god of the incorruptedest, the progressive goddess of the incorruptedest, the progressive goddesses of the incorruptedest, the progressive goddess of the incorruptedest, the regressive god of the incorruptedest, the regressive gods of the incorruptedest, the regressive god of the incorruptedest, the regressive goddess of the incorruptedest, the regressive goddesses of the incorruptedest, the regressive goddess of the incorruptedest, the ordinary god of the incorruptedest, the ordinary gods of the incorruptedest, the ordinary god of the incorruptedest, the ordinary goddess of the incorruptedest, the ordinary goddesses of the incorruptedest, the ordinary goddess of the incorruptedest, the extraordinary god of the incorruptedest, the extraordinary gods of the incorruptedest, the extraordinary god of the incorruptedest, the extraordinary goddess of the incorruptedest, the extraordinary goddesses of the incorruptedest, the extraordinary goddess of the incorruptedest, the static god of the incorruptedest, the static gods of the incorruptedest, the static god of the incorruptedest, the static goddess of the incorruptedest, the static goddesses of the incorruptedest, the static goddess of the incorruptedest, the dynamic god of the incorruptedest, the dynamic gods of the incorruptedest, the dynamic god of the incorruptedest, the dynamic goddess of the incorruptedest, the dynamic goddesses of the incorruptedest, the dynamic goddess of the incorruptedest, the land god of the incorruptedest, the land gods of the incorruptedest, the land god of the incorruptedest, the land goddess of the incorruptedest, the land goddesses of the incorruptedest, the land goddess of the incorruptedest, the sea god of the incorruptedest, the sea gods of the incorruptedest, the sea god of the incorruptedest, the sea goddess of the incorruptedest, the sea goddesses of the incorruptedest, the sea goddess of the incorruptedest, the sky god of the incorruptedest, the sky gods of the incorruptedest, the sky god of the incorruptedest, the sky goddess of the incorruptedest, the sky goddesses of the incorruptedest, the sky goddess of the incorruptedest, the god of the incorruptedest, the gods of the incorruptedest, the god of the incorruptedest, the goddess of the incorruptedest, the goddesses of the incorruptedest, the goddess of the incorruptedest, the half god of the incorruptedest, the half gods of the incorruptedest, the half god of the incorruptedest, the half goddess of the incorruptedest, the half goddesses of the incorruptedest, the half goddess of the incorruptedest, the vessel of the incorruptedest, the vessels of the incorruptedest, the vessel of the incorruptedest, the name of the incorruptedest, the names of the incorruptedest, the name of the incorruptedest, the person of the incorruptedest, the persons of the incorruptedest, the person of the incorruptedest, the persona of the incorruptedest, the personas of the incorruptedest, the persona of the incorruptedest, the personage of the incorruptedest, the personages of the incorruptedest, the personage of the incorruptedest, the personality of the incorruptedest, the personalities of the incorruptedest, the personality of the incorruptedest, the personification of the incorruptedest, the personifications of the incorruptedest, the personification of the incorruptedest, the image of the incorruptedest, the images of the incorruptedest, the image of the incorruptedest, the imagination of the incorruptedest, the imaginations of the incorruptedest, the imagination of the incorruptedest, the belief of the incorruptedest, the beliefs of the incorruptedest, the belief of the incorruptedest, the thought of the incorruptedest, the thoughts of the incorruptedest, the thought of the incorruptedest, the word of the incorruptedest, the words of the incorruptedest, the word of the incorruptedest, the action of the incorruptedest, the actions of the incorruptedest, the action of the incorruptedest, the reaction of the incorruptedest, the reactions of the incorruptedest, the reaction of the incorruptedest, the feeling of the incorruptedest, the feelings of the incorruptedest, the feeling of the incorruptedest, the situation of the incorruptedest, the situations of the incorruptedest, the situation of the incorruptedest, the circumstance of the incorruptedest, the circumstances of the incorruptedest, the circumstance of the incorruptedest, the environment of the incorruptedest, the environments of the incorruptedest, the environment of the incorruptedest, the relationship of the incorruptedest, the relationships of the incorruptedest, the relationship of the incorruptedest, the number of the incorruptedest, the numbers of the incorruptedest, the number of the incorruptedest, the formula of the incorruptedest, the formulas of the incorruptedest, the formula of the incorruptedest, the equation of the incorruptedest, the equations of the incorruptedest, the equation of the incorruptedest, the theory of the incorruptedest, the theories of the incorruptedest, the theory of the incorruptedest, the symbol of the incorruptedest, the symbols of the incorruptedest, the symbol of the incorruptedest, the color of the incorruptedest, the colors of the incorruptedest, the color of the incorruptedest, the thing of the incorruptedest, the things of the incorruptedest, the thing of the incorruptedest, the way of the incorruptedest, the ways of the incorruptedest, the way of the incorruptedest, the place of the incorruptedest, the places of the incorruptedest, the place of the incorruptedest, the time of the incorruptedest, the times of the incorruptedest, the time of the incorruptedest, the event of the incorruptedest, the events of the incorruptedest, the event of the incorruptedest, the result of the incorruptedest, the results of the incorruptedest, the result of the incorruptedest, the crown of the incorruptedest, the crowns of the incorruptedest, the crown of the incorruptedest, the throne of the incorruptedest, the thrones of the incorruptedest, the throne of the incorruptedest, the incorruptedest king, the incorruptedest kings, the incorruptedest kingdom, the incorruptedest kingdoms, the incorruptedest king's subject, the incorruptedest king's subjects, the incorruptedest king's dominion, the incorruptedest king's dominions, the kingdom of the incorruptedest, the kingdoms of the incorruptedest, the kingdom of the incorruptedest, the incorruptedest queen, the incorruptedest queens, the incorruptedest queendom, the incorruptedest queendoms, the incorruptedest queen subject, the incorruptedest queen subjects, the incorruptedest queen's dominion, the incorruptedest queen's dominions, the queendom of the incorruptedest, the queendoms of the incorruptedest, the queendom of the incorruptedest, the incorruptedest prince, the incorruptedest princes, the incorruptedest princedom, the incorruptedest princedoms, the incorruptedest prince's subject, the incorruptedest prince's subjects, the incorruptedest prince's dominion, the incorruptedest prince's dominions, the princedom of the incorruptedest, the princedoms of the incorruptedest, the princedom of the incorruptedest, the incorruptedest princess, the incorruptedest princesses, the incorruptedest princessdom, the incorruptedest princessdoms, the incorruptedest princess's subject, the incorruptedest princess's subjects, the incorruptedest princess's dominion, the incorruptedest princess's dominions, the princessdom of the incorruptedest, the princessdoms of the incorruptedest, the princessdom of the incorruptedest, the lord of the incorruptedest, the lords of the incorruptedest, the lord of the incorruptedest, the lordess of the incorruptedest, the lordesses of the incorruptedest, the lordess of the incorruptedest, the priest of the incorruptedest, the priests of the incorruptedest, the priest of the incorruptedest, the priestess of the incorruptedest, the priestesses of the incorruptedest, the priestess of the incorruptedest, the ritual of the incorruptedest, the rituals of the incorruptedest, the ritual of the incorruptedest, the shrine of the incorruptedest, the shrines of the incorruptedest, the shrine of the incorruptedest, the temple of the incorruptedest, the temples of the incorruptedest, the temple of the incorruptedest, the leader of the incorruptedest, the leaders of the incorruptedest, the leader of the incorruptedest, the follower of the incorruptedest, the followers of the incorruptedest, the follower of the incorruptedest, the natural substance of the incorruptedest, the natural substances of the incorruptedest, the natural substance of the incorruptedest, the supernatural substance of the incorruptedest, the supernatural substances of the incorruptedest, the supernatural substance of the incorruptedest, the temporal substance of the incorruptedest, the temporal substances of the incorruptedest, the temporal substance of the incorruptedest, the spiritual substance of the incorruptedest, the spiritual substances of the incorruptedest, the spiritual substance of the incorruptedest, the natural form of the incorruptedest, the natural forms of the Incorruptedest, the natural form of the Incorruptedest, the supernatural form of the Incorruptedest, the supernatural forms of the Incorruptedest, the supernatural form of the Incorruptedest, the temporal form of the Incorruptedest, the temporal forms of the Incorruptedest, the temporal form of the Incorruptedest, the spiritual form of the Incorruptedest, the spiritual forms of the Incorruptedest, the spiritual form of the Incorruptedest, the age of the Incorruptedest, the ages of the Incorruptedest, the age of the Incorruptedest, the era of the Incorruptedest, the eras of the Incorruptedest, the era of the Incorruptedest, the awakener of the Incorruptedest, the awakeners of the Incorruptedest, the awakener of the Incorruptedest, the awakening of the Incorruptedest, the awakenings of the Incorruptedest, the awakening of the Incorruptedest, the realm of the Incorruptedest, the realms of the Incorruptedest, the realm of the Incorruptedest, the dimension of the Incorruptedest, the dimensions of the Incorruptedest, the dimension of the Incorruptedest, the zone of the Incorruptedest, the zones of the Incorruptedest, the zone of the Incorruptedest, the frequency of the Incorruptedest, the frequencies of the Incorruptedest, the frequency of the Incorruptedest, the century of the Incorruptedest, the centuries of the Incorruptedest, the century of the Incorruptedest, the millennium of the Incorruptedest, the millenniums of the Incorruptedest, the millennium of the Incorruptedest, the purpose of the Incorruptedest, the purposes of the Incorruptedest, the purpose of the Incorruptedest, the meaning of the Incorruptedest, the meanings of the Incorruptedest, the meaning of the Incorruptedest, the culture of the Incorruptedest, the cultures of the Incorruptedest, the culture of the Incorruptedest, the demonstrator of the Incorruptedest, the demonstrators of the Incorruptedest, the demonstrator of the Incorruptedest, the demonstration of the Incorruptedest, the demonstrations of the Incorruptedest, the demonstration of the Incorruptedest, the manifester of the Incorruptedest, the manifestors of the Incorruptedest, the manifester of the Incorruptedest, the manifestation of the Incorruptedest, the manifestations of the Incorruptedest, the manifestation of the Incorruptedest, the presence of the Incorruptedest, the presences of the Incorruptedest, the presence of the Incorruptedest, the glow of the Incorruptedest, the glows of the Incorruptedest, the glow of the Incorruptedest, the goal of the Incorruptedest, the goals of the Incorruptedest, the goal of the Incorruptedest, the plan of the Incorruptedest, the plans of the Incorruptedest, the plan of the Incorruptedest, the book of the Incorruptedest, the books of the Incorruptedest, the book of the Incorruptedest, the philosopher of the Incorruptedest, the philosophers of the Incorruptedest, the philosopher of the Incorruptedest, the philosophy of the Incorruptedest, the philosophies of the Incorruptedest, the philosophy of the Incorruptedest, the releaser of the Incorruptedest, the releasers of the Incorruptedest, the releaser of the Incorruptedest, the release of the Incorruptedest, the releases of the Incorruptedest, the release of the Incorruptedest, the variable of the Incorruptedest, the variables of the Incorruptedest, the variable of the Incorruptedest, the cause of the Incorruptedest, the causes of the Incorruptedest, the cause of the Incorruptedest, the effect of the Incorruptedest, the effects of the Incorruptedest, the effect of the Incorruptedest, the journey of the Incorruptedest, the journeys of the Incorruptedest, the journey of the Incorruptedest, the emergence of the Incorruptedest, the emergences of the Incorruptedest, the emergence of the Incorruptedest, the source of the Incorruptedest, the sources of the Incorruptedest, the source of the Incorruptedest, the originator of the Incorruptedest, the originators of the Incorruptedest, the originator of the Incorruptedest, the origin of the Incorruptedest, the origins of the Incorruptedest, the origin of the Incorruptedest, the forefather of the Incorruptedest, the forefathers of the Incorruptedest, the forefather of the Incorruptedest, the foremother of the Incorruptedest, the foremothers of the Incorruptedest, the foremother of the Incorruptedest, the ancestor of the Incorruptedest, the ancestors of the Incorruptedest, the ancestor of the Incorruptedest, the descendant of the Incorruptedest, the descendants of the Incorruptedest, the descendant of the Incorruptedest, the lineage of the Incorruptedest, the lineages of the Incorruptedest, the lineage of the Incorruptedest, the heritage of the Incorruptedest, the heritages of the Incorruptedest, the heritage of the Incorruptedest, the heir of the Incorruptedest, the heirs of the Incorruptedest, the heir of the Incorruptedest, the co-heir of the Incorruptedest, the co-heirs of the Incorruptedest, the co-heir of the Incorruptedest, the joint heir of the Incorruptedest, the joint heirs of the Incorruptedest, the joint heir of the Incorruptedest, the dynasty of the Incorruptedest, the dynasties of the Incorruptedest, the dynasty of the Incorruptedest, the force of the Incorruptedest, the forces of the Incorruptedest, the force of the Incorruptedest, the law of the Incorruptedest, the laws of the Incorruptedest, the law of the Incorruptedest, the pact of the Incorruptedest, the pacts of the Incorruptedest, the pact of the Incorruptedest, the game of the Incorruptedest, the games of the Incorruptedest, the game of the Incorruptedest, the mask of the Incorruptedest, the masks of the Incorruptedest, the mask of the Incorruptedest, the armor of the Incorruptedest, the armors of the Incorruptedest, the armor of the Incorruptedest, the sword of the Incorruptedest, the swords of the Incorruptedest, the sword of the Incorruptedest, the shield of the Incorruptedest, the shields of the Incorruptedest, the shield of the Incorruptedest, the force shield of the Incorruptedest, the force shields of the Incorruptedest, the force shield of the Incorruptedest, the armored force shield of the Incorruptedest, the armored force shields of the Incorruptedest, the armored force shield of the Incorruptedest, the champion of the Incorruptedest, the champions of the Incorruptedest, the champion of the Incorruptedest, the guardian of the Incorruptedest, the guardians of the Incorruptedest, the guardian of the Incorruptedest, the defender of the Incorruptedest, the defenders of the Incorruptedest, the defender of the Incorruptedest, the protector of the Incorruptedest, the protectors of the Incorruptedest, the protector of the Incorruptedest, the chant of the Incorruptedest, the chants of the Incorruptedest, the chant of the Incorruptedest, the shape of the Incorruptedest, the shapes of the Incorruptedest, the shape of the Incorruptedest, the cube of the Incorruptedest, the cubes of the Incorruptedest, the cube of the Incorruptedest, the cuboid of the Incorruptedest, the cuboids of the Incorruptedest, the cuboid of the Incorruptedest, the sphere of the Incorruptedest, the spheres of the Incorruptedest, the sphere of the Incorruptedest, the spheroid of the Incorruptedest, the spheroids of the Incorruptedest, the spheroid of the Incorruptedest, the prism of the Incorruptedest, the prisms of the Incorruptedest, the prism of the Incorruptedest, the pyramid of the Incorruptedest, the pyramids of the Incorruptedest, the pyramid of the Incorruptedest, the cylinder of the Incorruptedest, the cylinders of the Incorruptedest, the cylinder of the Incorruptedest, the cone of the Incorruptedest, the cones of the Incorruptedest, the cone of the Incorruptedest, the triangle of the Incorruptedest, the triangles of the Incorruptedest, the triangle of the Incorruptedest, the circle of the Incorruptedest, the circles of the Incorruptedest, the circle of the Incorruptedest, the semicircle of the Incorruptedest, the semicircles of the Incorruptedest, the semicircle of the Incorruptedest, the square of the Incorruptedest, the squares of the Incorruptedest, the square of the Incorruptedest, the rectangle of the Incorruptedest, the rectangles of the Incorruptedest, the rectangle of the Incorruptedest, the parallelogram of the Incorruptedest, the parallelograms of the Incorruptedest, the parallelogram of the Incorruptedest, the rhombus of the Incorruptedest, the rhombuses of the Incorruptedest, the rhombus of the Incorruptedest, the trapezoid of the Incorruptedest, the trapezoids of the Incorruptedest, the trapezoid of the Incorruptedest, the polygon of the Incorruptedest, the polygons of the Incorruptedest, the polygon of the Incorruptedest, the pentagon of the Incorruptedest, the pentagons of the Incorruptedest, the pentagon of the Incorruptedest, the hexagon of the Incorruptedest, the hexagons of the Incorruptedest, the hexagon of the Incorruptedest, the septagon of the Incorruptedest, the septagons of the Incorruptedest, the septagon of the Incorruptedest, the octagon of the Incorruptedest, the octagons of the Incorruptedest, the octagon of the Incorruptedest, the nonagon of the Incorruptedest, the nonagons of the Incorruptedest, the nonagon of the Incorruptedest, the decagon of the Incorruptedest, the decagons of the Incorruptedest, the decagon of the Incorruptedest, the evolution of the Incorruptedest, the evolutions of the Incorruptedest, the evolution of the Incorruptedest, the revolution of the Incorruptedest, the revolutions of the Incorruptedest, the revolution of the Incorruptedest, the elemental art of the Incorruptedest, the elemental arts of the Incorruptedest, the elemental art of the Incorruptedest, the elemental science of the Incorruptedest, the elemental sciences of the Incorruptedest, the elemental science of the Incorruptedest, the elemental principle of the Incorruptedest, the elemental principles of the Incorruptedest, the elemental principle of the Incorruptedest, the elemental technology of the Incorruptedest, the elemental technologies of the Incorruptedest, the elemental technology of the Incorruptedest, the low elemental art of the Incorruptedest, the low elemental arts of the Incorruptedest, the low elemental art of the Incorruptedest, the low elemental science of the Incorruptedest, the low elemental sciences of the Incorruptedest, the low elemental science of the Incorruptedest, the low elemental principle of the Incorruptedest, the low elemental principles of the Incorruptedest, the low elemental principle of the Incorruptedest, the low elemental technology of the Incorruptedest, the low elemental technologies of the Incorruptedest, the low elemental technology of the Incorruptedest, the high elemental art of the Incorruptedest, the high elemental arts of the Incorruptedest, the high elemental art of the Incorruptedest, the high elemental science of the Incorruptedest, the high elemental sciences of the Incorruptedest, the high elemental science of the Incorruptedest, the high elemental principle of the Incorruptedest, the high elemental principles of the Incorruptedest, the high elemental principle of the Incorruptedest, the high elemental technology of the Incorruptedest, the high elemental technologies of the Incorruptedest, the high elemental technology of the Incorruptedest, the agent of the Incorruptedest, the agents of the Incorruptedest, the agent of the Incorruptedest, the agency of the Incorruptedest, the agencies of the Incorruptedest, the agency of the Incorruptedest, the amplifier of the Incorruptedest, the amplifiers of the Incorruptedest, the amplifier of the Incorruptedest, the amplification of the Incorruptedest, the amplifications of the Incorruptedest, the amplification of the Incorruptedest, the enhancer of the Incorruptedest, the enhancers of the Incorruptedest, the enhancer of the Incorruptedest, the enhancement of the Incorruptedest, the enhancements of the Incorruptedest, the enhancement of the Incorruptedest, the magnifier of the Incorruptedest, the magnifiers of the Incorruptedest, the magnifier of the Incorruptedest, the magnification of the Incorruptedest, the magnifications of the Incorruptedest, the magnification of the Incorruptedest, the influencer of the Incorruptedest, the influencers of the Incorruptedest, the influencer of the Incorruptedest, the influence of the Incorruptedest, the influences of the Incorruptedest, the influence of the Incorruptedest, the emanator of the Incorruptedest, the emanators of the Incorruptedest, the emanator of the Incorruptedest, the emanation of the Incorruptedest, the emanations of the Incorruptedest, the emanation of the Incorruptedest, the converger of the Incorruptedest, the convergers of the Incorruptedest, the converger of the Incorruptedest, the convergence of the Incorruptedest, the convergences of the Incorruptedest, the convergence of the Incorruptedest, the aura of the Incorruptedest, the auras of the Incorruptedest, the aura of the Incorruptedest, the impression of the Incorruptedest, the impressions of the Incorruptedest, the impression of the Incorruptedest, the intelligence of the Incorruptedest, the intelligences of the Incorruptedest, the intelligence of the Incorruptedest, the sophistication of the Incorruptedest, the sophistications of the Incorruptedest, the sophistication of the Incorruptedest, the genius of the Incorruptedest, the geniuses of the Incorruptedest, the genius of the Incorruptedest, the polymath of the Incorruptedest, the polymaths of the Incorruptedest, the polymath of the Incorruptedest, the psychic of the Incorruptedest, the psychics of the Incorruptedest, the psychic of the Incorruptedest, the knowledge of the Incorruptedest, the knowledges of the Incorruptedest, the knowledge of the Incorruptedest, the understanding of the Incorruptedest, the understandings of the Incorruptedest, the understanding of the Incorruptedest, the wisdom of the Incorruptedest, the wisdoms of the Incorruptedest, the wisdom of the Incorruptedest, the secret of the Incorruptedest, the secrets of the Incorruptedest, the secret of the Incorruptedest, the mystery of the Incorruptedest, the mysteries of the Incorruptedest, the mystery of the Incorruptedest, the revelation of the Incorruptedest, the revelations of the Incorruptedest, the revelation of the Incorruptedest, the tactic of the Incorruptedest, the tactics of the Incorruptedest, the tactic of the Incorruptedest, the strategy of the Incorruptedest, the strategies of the Incorruptedest, the strategy of the Incorruptedest, the strength of the Incorruptedest, the strengths of the Incorruptedest, the strength of the Incorruptedest, the might of the Incorruptedest, the mights of the Incorruptedest, the might of the Incorruptedest, the power of the Incorruptedest, the powers of the Incorruptedest, the power of the Incorruptedest, the authority of the Incorruptedest, the authorities of the Incorruptedest, the authority of the Incorruptedest, the dominion of the Incorruptedest, the dominions of the Incorruptedest, the dominion of the Incorruptedest, the rhythm of the Incorruptedest, the rhythms of the Incorruptedest, the rhythm of the Incorruptedest, the melody of the Incorruptedest, the melodies of the Incorruptedest, the melody of the Incorruptedest, the music of the Incorruptedest, the musics of the Incorruptedest, the music of the Incorruptedest, the lyric of the Incorruptedest, the lyrics of the Incorruptedest, the lyric of the Incorruptedest, the song of the Incorruptedest, the songs of the Incorruptedest, the song of the Incorruptedest, the dance of the Incorruptedest, the dances of the Incorruptedest, the dance of the Incorruptedest, the spirit of the Incorruptedest, the spirits of the Incorruptedest, the spirit of the Incorruptedest, the soul of the Incorruptedest, the souls of the Incorruptedest, the soul of the Incorruptedest, the body of the Incorruptedest, the bodies of the Incorruptedest, the body of the Incorruptedest, the mark of the Incorruptedest, the marks of the Incorruptedest, the mark of the Incorruptedest, the promise of the Incorruptedest, the promises of the Incorruptedest, the promise of the Incorruptedest, the visionary of the Incorruptedest, the visionaries of the Incorruptedest, the visionary of the Incorruptedest, the vision of the Incorruptedest, the visions of the Incorruptedest, the vision of the Incorruptedest, the picture of the Incorruptedest, the pictures of the Incorruptedest, the picture of the Incorruptedest, the sound of the Incorruptedest, the sounds of the Incorruptedest, the sound of the Incorruptedest, the tongue of the Incorruptedest, the tongues of the Incorruptedest, the tongue of the Incorruptedest, the language of the Incorruptedest, the languages of the Incorruptedest, the language of the Incorruptedest, the communication of the Incorruptedest, the communications of the Incorruptedest, the communication of the Incorruptedest, the people of the Incorruptedest, the peoples of the Incorruptedest, the people of the Incorruptedest, the society of the Incorruptedest, the societies of the Incorruptedest, the society of the Incorruptedest, the fortress of the Incorruptedest, the fortresses of the Incorruptedest, the fortress of the Incorruptedest, the government of the Incorruptedest, the governments of the Incorruptedest, the government of the Incorruptedest, the city of the Incorruptedest, the cities of the Incorruptedest, the city of the Incorruptedest, the nation of the Incorruptedest, the nations of the Incorruptedest, the nation of the Incorruptedest, the civilization of the Incorruptedest, the civilizations of the Incorruptedest, the civilization of the Incorruptedest, the world of the Incorruptedest, the worlds of the Incorruptedest, the world of the Incorruptedest,